Hi again. I've moved my studio back into my office, so we'll see how that goes. What I would like to do today is give you a brief run-through of Elegy written in a country churchyard by Thomas Gray. You've all read this and you've already written your summaries. And as I said in the written introduction that I sent you, usually this poem is thought of as one of the first to take Peasants' life sympathetically and present it in a positive way. I want to do a reading that runs a little bit counter to that idea. Not really a new reading. Other people have obviously thought this before. Some of you saw elements of this in your summaries, but I want to go over it fairly closely, and I also want to link it to the PowerPoint that I sent you, so you can maybe follow along on the PowerPoint as I take you through the poem. So to begin with, I already said in the introduction, this begins at twilight in a country churchyard. We can hear the sheep coming from the folds in the distance. The plowman is coming home, the lowing herd, meaning cows. He immediately references the peasantry and what they do for a living. There's also a little bit of an element of the sublime, not really the scary sublime, but more just the sublime that makes things a little bit, how shall I say it, attention-getting in terms of being not quite as familiar and possibly a little bit obscure and more unknown than everyday life. It is twilight, it is a graveyard, there's a ivy-covered tower, there's an owl, of course, the perfect ingredient, and finally the moon, very important in the scenes like this. But the lines I want to focus on begin in stanza 4, when he looks around and he actually begins to contemplate the graves, the gravestones, or in many cases perhaps just wooden crosses, we don't know, but they clearly are not very elaborate, of the peasants who are buried there. And he begins to think not about what they were like in death, but what they were like in life. So in stanza 5, he says, "The breezy call of incense-bearing morn, the swallow twittering from the straw-built shed, the cock's shrill clarion, or the echoing horn, no more shall rouse them from their lowly bed." So they are not going to wake up anymore, but he wants to imagine now what they were like when they were alive. "For them no more the blazing hearth shall burn, or busy housewife ply her evening care. No children run to lisp their sire's return, or climb his knees the envied kiss to share." Now, if we were in class, I would say, okay, tell me something about the peasants' lives from this quatrain. First of all, what's the fire like? Blazing. What does this imply? That they've got lots of wood. It's pretty toasty there inside the old cottage. Secondly, the housewife is busy. Her evening care, presumably, is to make food. This implies that there's a lot of food that she has to make, and she's busy making it. Third, there are children who come running up to Daddy when he comes home, presumably in time for dinner, which means he hasn't worked a very long day, and climb up on his knee so these children can kiss him. What we don't see is the majority of peasants in England. This picture is effectively a Disneyfication, I guess you could call it today, of peasant life. Most peasants didn't have enough firewood to stay warm. They had to burn little bits of coal or peat, or they froze to death. Very common. Secondly, most peasants didn't have enough to eat. So the housewife is not going to be hustling around with all this food trying to get it done in time on the blazing fire. She's going to have very little food, and there's not going to be a blazing fire. Thirdly, the children were probably scrawny, probably full of lice, probably relatively violent, and were not necessarily plump little cherubs who want to climb up on daddy's knee. But this propensity to clean up the peasantry, so that sensibility then, or people imbued with sensibility could feel empathetic toward them, is pervasive during the 1750s, 1760s, and 1770s. Peasants are painted the way the upper classes want to wish they were. Painted, and I mean both in poetry and in actual paintings. And so for my first exhibit, I'd like you to look at the PowerPoint, very, very famous painting called The Cottage Door by Thomas Gainsborough. And there you will see the quaint peasant thatched cottage, and outside of it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 plump little children, nobody fighting, a plump little baby, and a peasant wife who, if you look closely at her, and let's go to the next slide, looks a heck of a lot like another portrait by Thomas Gainsborough of Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire. She looks like she's just come from the hairdresser. Look at that hair, look at the rouge on her cheeks. She's like an actress from Drury Lane Theatre, pretending to be a peasant. All right, let's go to the next stanza. Now we're moving to the men and what they do during the day. Oft did the harvest to their sickle yield, the furrow oft the stubborn glebe has broke. Glebe just means it's a piece of land, glebe land. How jocund did they drive their team afield, how bowed the woods beneath their sturdy stroke. What's jocund mean? It means happy. It means, hey Joe, let's go out and plow those fields again, woohoo! It doesn't mean, oh my God, 16 hours out here breaking my back for nothing, so this nobleman can have his great estate. No, they're happy to go to work. Once again, the cleaned up peasantry, the peasantry who are absolutely artificial. Now, I'm not saying all peasants were unhappy. I'm sure there were 20% of the peasants who lived pretty decent lives. In general, they were not happy. They worked hard. They had many injuries. They froze to death in the winter. They died young. So this is, I think, something you really have to think about when you look at sensibility and look at the sympathy toward the poor. The question is the sympathy really toward the poor or towards a made-up version of the poor that then is easy to be sympathetic to? To close this American analogy, I'm not going to spend much time on it because it's highly controversial, though everybody knows what the actual truth of it is the way in the antebellum South, all these myths arose about the happy Negroes playing their banjo on the old, cabin where they got to live, and then happily going to the fields and picking cotton because they loved the massa. Yeah, no. These were oppressed black people who had been taken from Africa and who were generally miserable. But that's not the way the landowners wanted to think of them. That's not the propaganda they wanted to put out there. So, right from the beginning with Gray, in this poem that is famous for looking at the peasants empathetically, it certainly does. But the problem is the peasants it's looking at empathetically aren't really peasants. They're Disney peasants. So, it gets a little complex. In any case, moving to the next few stanzas, I don't want to spend much time on them because they're pretty direct. He may be making the peasants better than they are, but he is definitely and unequivocally making the great into the villains. He slams wealth, he slams ambition, And basically the thesis here is death is the great leveler, so you can have all the stuff that you want, you can laugh at the peasantry all you want, but in the end, here in this graveyard where I'm standing, you're all going to be the same. Relatively cliched idea, but he's putting it out there as a class statement, a class-based statement. Effectively saying even your big monuments aren't going to make anything different from you after you, for you after you die. What these peasants here have, these crummy little tombstones or whatever, your big monuments, once you're dead, it does not matter. Then he gets to the central part of the first half of the poem, when, despite having conveyed peasant life as actually a fairly pleasant form of living, he begins to look at what they lack. And the main thing they lack, according to him, is education, is an ability through education to raise themselves, to fulfill whatever genius, whatever talent they may have within them. It's a very, very important part of the poem. He says, perhaps in this neglected spot is laid some heart once pregnant with celestial fire. Hands the rod of empire might have swayed, or waked to ecstasy the living lyre. In other words, someone who might have been a great preacher, someone who might have been a great leader of an empire, somebody who might have been a great poet. The lyre, of course, like in Homer, is a symbol for poetry. But knowledge to their eyes, her ample page rich with the spoils of time, did near enroll. Chill penury repressed their noble rage, and froze the genial current of the soul. Now he gets closer to it. He says, lack of knowledge and also penury, which means being poor, did not allow them to have this chance. The imagery is really interesting, though, because he actually says the image is that the penury freezes the genial current of the soul. The 2 years prior to this poem being written, there had been horrible winters in England, 2 years running, and in the newspapers there would appear stories about how peasants were found frozen in their cottages. I'm not sure Gray is glancing at that here or alluding to it, but in fact it's not just a metaphor. Peasants froze to death during those winters. In any case, then the most often quoted, I think, or second most often quoted quatrain of the poem, which I think is ridiculous, and who cares about the, gems at the bottom of the ocean and flowers in the desert. I'm skipping that. And then he really gets to the meat of it, and it gets extremely complicated when he names three people, or types of people that these peasants might have become. The first is Hamden. This is on line 58, 57. Hamden, with dauntless breast, the little tyrant of his fields withstood. Some mute inglorious Milton here may rest, some Cromwell guiltless of his country's blood. I know the poems I gave you did not have notes. I am going to provide the notes right now. Hamden was a rebel, leader in Parliament during or just before and during the English Revolution. Milton, of course, one of the greatest, if not the greatest of all English poets, wrote Paradise Lost and so forth, was a sympathizer with the Puritan side, with the rebel side, who were rebelling against the monarchy. And he eventually was given the title of Secretary of Foreign Tongues. That is to say, he took care of all Latin correspondence with the countries on the continent, France, Spain, and so forth, for the Commonwealth. He knew Cromwell. He was a regicide, someone who actually was in favor of the beheading of Charles I once Charles was captured in 1649. So we have one rebel, we have two rebels, and the last one is Cromwell himself, the leader of the rebels. So Gray picks out three people to exemplify what peasants, if educated, might have achieved, being a great politician, being the greatest poet, possibly, certainly the greatest epic poet in England ever, or being a great battle leader, and for a while, during the Protectorate, actually the ruler, de facto ruler of England, Hampden, Milton, and Cromwell. Whoa, what do these guys have in common? They're all rebels. So this seems then to make Gray stop and think, what am I saying here? Listen to what he does. The applause of listening senates to command, the threats of pain and ruin to despise, to scatter plenty o'er the smiling land and read their history in the nation's eyes, their lot forbade. Okay, they could have done all those things, but because they were peasants, they couldn't. But he almost says it with a sense of relief. And now watch where he goes from here. Nor circumscribed alone their growing virtues, but their crimes confined. Is he implying that possibly some of the things Milton and Cromwell did were crimes? Listen to this now. Forbade to wade through slaughter to a throne? And shut the gates of mercy on mankind? The struggling pangs of conscious truth to hide, to quench the blushes of ingenuous shame, or heap the shrine of luxury and pride with incense kindled at the muse's flame? He seems to have done a complete 180 here. Well, yes, maybe it didn't allow them to become educated and rise to be great battle leaders, great poets, or great politicians, but it kept them from being evil versions of all of those things as well. He almost seems to be saying ignorance is bliss. So let's move to the next stanza. Far from the madding crowd, you've heard that before, it's the title of a novel by Thomas Hardy. He stole it. Well, no, I mean, he's quoting Gray 100 years later. Notice it's not maddening, it's madding. It means running mad. Far from the madding crowd's ignoble strife, their sober wishes never learn to stray. Along the cool sequestered veil of life, they kept the noiseless tenor of their way. In other words, far from the crazed mobs who are making a mess in the cities, these peasants were sober. They weren't drunk in mobs looking for power. They didn't stray. They didn't do that. No. Instead, in the cool sequestered veil of life, they kept the noiseless. They never spoke up. They never rebelled. They never were a mob. And he seems to be endorsing this. This is what makes the first half of the poem complicated. At first he says, oh, look at these peasants. Well, they have a pretty good life already, but they never got educated and therefore could not unlock their inner virtues and talents. So if only we would educate them, things would be great, and they might become X, Y, and Z. But wait, people like X, Y, and Z can also be evil X, Y, and Z. So maybe it's better that they didn't learn all of this stuff. In fact, yeah, it's great, because they might have turned into a drunken mob, but instead they just stayed here in the country without knowing anything and never said anything, therefore were noiseless, and then died and got buried in these graves. Awesome. What? Wait, that's the opposite of what he seems to be praised for doing this poem, which is saying they should have education so that they can unlock their virtues. I leave it up to you. What do you think Gray is saying? I mean, can he have his cake and eat it too? I don't know. All right, in any case, then he turns back to their little graves, discovers that, in fact, some of the things on them are even misspelled, but says, but it's still okay. They have their little memorials. This is all very nice. And then we get to the second part of the poem, which is even more confusing than the first part of the poem, the part that begins, For thee who mindful of the unhonored dead. What I will leave you with now, because I've already gone on too long, and I'll make another video to back this one up or carry it forward, is who the heck is thee? For thee, for who? For what? Who is the poet talking to? I thought the poet was alone in a graveyard, where by now, given as much poetry as he's written, one assumes it's probably 10 at night. For thee. Think about it.